Hi, I'm Jessica Coates from the Rights Management team in the National Library of Australia. The National Library has an amazing collection of published and unpublished materials. But in order to access and use these materials, you need to understand your legal rights and obligations in relation to them. I'm here today to talk to you about one important part of this, copyright. But first, I'd like to say that the National Library of Australia acknowledges Australia's First Nations people, the first Australians, as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and give respect to their elders, past and present, and through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people. So, what is copyright? Copyright is an area of law which gives creators rights to control how others can make use of their creations. It lets them make decisions about how their works are copied, published, performed, sold, or even just distributed to others. Copyright exists to encourage people to create. The logic is that allowing people to control how others to use their creative works, at least for a period, will encourage people to create more material and to share their creations with others, which is good for us all. In Australia, copyright is governed by the Federal Copyright Act 1968, meaning the same rules apply across Australia. It doesn't matter if the material was created overseas. As long as you're using the material here in Australia, Australian law applies. Copyright is extremely broad and covers all types of materials, from buildings to computers to tweets. This includes almost all library materials, including literary works such as books and letters, dramatic works like plays, artistic works like paintings or photographs, and musical compositions. It also applies to films and sound recordings like movies, oral histories, or even just home videos. These materials are protected automatically as soon as they're created, even if they aren't published and even if there's no copyright notice or date. It doesn't matter if the work is professional or amateur, or commercial or private. The same rules apply to a quick doodle on a napkin or an oil painting or a CGI monster. For works covered by copyright, you will usually need the creator's legal permission if you want to use it, even for non-commercial uses like just posting it to a blog or sharing it with someone else. Libraries won't usually be able to give you that permission themselves. This is because copyright is separate from physical ownership. So even if the library owns a manuscript or a drawing, for example, it won't usually own the copyright in them, but we'll help you understand your rights and obligations to use the material as much as we can. So when can you use copyright material? Copyright is extremely broad, but the good news is that it does have limits. For example, copyright doesn't stop you from making use of ideas or information contained in a work, just the actual work itself. So while you can't copy the exact sentence or picture that's been created, you can build on the ideas and knowledge the work contains. This is essential for all innovation and growth of human knowledge. Also, copyright only lasts a set amount of time. Once copyright ends, the material is out of copyright and is said to have entered the public domain. It can then generally be freely used in any way you like, subject to other rights such as Indigenous, cultural and intellectual property, or just privacy. This is an essential part of the copyright bargain. Creators get to control their works, but only for a limited amount of time. If copyright lasted forever, people wouldn't be able to build on the knowledge of the past, and copyright would become a barrier to innovation or cultural growth instead of encouraging it. While copyright doesn't last forever, it can last a very long time. For most works in Australia, the copyright term is the life of the author plus 70 years. As such, even very old works can still be protected by copyright. But the good news is that even while a work is protected by copyright, there are some things you can do without permission. These are called exceptions. Exceptions protect uses that are in the public interest, like education, research, or accessibility. They're an essential part of the copyright ecosystem and ensure that copyright doesn't become a burden on daily life or important human rights like freedom of speech. Without them, we'd end up with absurd results like kids needing to get copyright permissions to do their homework. I'll talk more about exceptions later. But It is important to remember that even if the material you want to use is covered by copyright and your use doesn't fall within an exception, it doesn't mean you can't do it, just that you will have to get permission from the copyright owner. I'll talk more about how the library can help you with that later too. So now, some myths about copyright. Copyright is extremely complex, and this means that people think that things that people think they know about copyright is often not true. For example, one of the most common myths about copyright is that it doesn't apply to private or non-commercial uses. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. While there are exceptions that do allow private use in some circumstances, like recording TV to watch later or transferring your music to a digital device, there is no general rule that says uses are okay just because they're private or non-commercial. You will still need permission from the copyright owner for a non-commercial use most of the time, unless your use is covered by an exception. People also often think that you don't need permission to use copyright material if your use is fair. This is because the US has an exception that allows general fair use of copyright material, but Australian copyright law doesn't go this far. One of the exceptions I mentioned earlier does allow fair dealings, but only if they are one of a list of permitted purposes set out in the Copyright Act. These include research and study, criticism and review, parody and satire, reporting the news, judicial advice, or accessibility. You can find out more about fair dealings and other exceptions from the Australian Libraries and Archives Copyright Coalition or the Australian Copyright Council. Similarly, many people believe that as long as you're only using 10% of a work or a small part, your use is okay. While there is a rule under Australian law that lets you use an insubstantial part of copyright work, it only applies to amounts that are less than 10% and will be very hard and can be very hard to apply. You can't usually rely on it for things like quotes, clips, or samples. Luckily, you can quote material without permission under the fair dealing exceptions, and copying 10% would usually be covered by that. But remember, this is for it has to be for one of those specified purposes like research and study. If you just want to quote a work for artistic effect, for example, in a blog or a remix work or even a book, you will usually need permission from the copyright owner. It's also very common on the internet for people to use copyright material like background music in a video and then to credit the author. While this is always a good idea to attribute the creator of the material that you're using, it's actually a legal requirement under Australian law. This doesn't replace permission. You will still infringe copyright if you don't have permission or a relevant exception, even if you say no infringement intended. And finally, as we said before, copyright in Australia does last a very long time. Many people believe that you can use copyright material once the author has died. But some materials will be protected for more than 150 years after they're made. It's usually best to assume something is still in copyright for at least 100 years, unless you know for sure that this isn't the case. The good news, though, is that some materials do have shorter copyright terms. For instance, anonymous works or works where you don't know anything about the author will have a copyright term of 70 years from creation or publication, and government works only have a copyright term of 50 years. But if you don't know much about the work or its creator, it's best to assume it is still covered by copyright. Don't worry, we'll do our best to help you work out if and how you can make use of it anyway. Because copyright applies to most library materials and to most uses you want to make of those materials, it's important to consider copyright whenever you want to use our collections. If you just want to look at or read material on site at a library, you don't usually have to worry about copyright. But if you want to make a copy or have the library make a copy for you, or even just use the library material in some downstream way, like publishing it as part of your research, you do need to think about copyright. Luckily, there are specific exceptions in the Copyright Act that give you the right to use material for purposes like research, even without permission from the copyright owner. Similar exceptions also allow the library to supply material for you, if you can't make it on site, though this is only in certain circumstances and if you comply with set rules. You will usually be able to copy small parts of copyright work for research purposes without permission. This includes photocopying the material and taking photographs with your own device. You can usually find signs near the library photocopiers or at the desk that will give you more information about when you can copy material and how much. If you want to copy more than a small amount of the material or want the library to copy the material and send it to you, you will generally need to talk to the library to find out if any permissions are required. Access to some of our materials, especially special collections such as manuscripts and oral histories, may also be restricted for reasons other than copyright, such as privacy or cultural sensitivity. Other works, like electronic materials, might be limited by a license. So it's important to check before copying any more than a small part of our material. The first step to obtain information about using National Library materials is to check the entry in the catalogue or on Trove. There you'll be able to find basic information about their author and publisher and their copyright status, including whether they're available to access to copy. In the National Library, this information is determined by an algorithm based on information we have in our catalogue. So it's intended as an estimate and may not be accurate. If we don't have enough information or if the rights are particularly complex, sometimes it will come back uncertain. You shouldn't rely on it instead of formal legal advice, but it can give you a good indicator of how you can use the material. A lot of our collection is in the public domain and doesn't have any other restrictions on access. If there's a digital copy of these kind of materials online, you can often download them straight from our website and use them immediately. But if the copyright status is unclear or restrictions apply, or if you want to do something complex like publishing the material, you will normally need to go to Ask a Librarian on our website. There you can ask questions about using the material or put in a request for the library to supply a copy to you. Once you tell us exactly what you want to use and how you want to use it, we'll usually be able to tell you if your use is allowed or if permission is needed. If permission is required, it will usually be up to you to contact the copyright owner yourself. But the library will help you as much as we can with the information we have. Once you do have permission for your use, we can supply the material for you. We will usually ask you to comply with a few conditions of use, like respecting the moral rights of the creator. You will have to credit them as the creator whenever you use the material, and you mustn't treat the work in a derogatory way. These are legal requirements under the Copyright Act and can't be waived. If you're publishing the material or using it in a public way, we will also usually ask you to credit the library as the source of the material. This helps others to know where they can find the original, if they want to make use of it themselves, and generally helps us to increase knowledge of and access to our collections. To find out more about using copyright in the library's collection, go to our website, Copyright in Library Collections. You can find it via the copyright link at the bottom of each page of our website. By clicking on that link, you'll be taken to our copyright portal, which includes a link directly to Copyright in Library Collections, as well as other useful copyright information. There are also some great resources in Australian copyright law online. Two good places to start are the Australian Libraries and Archives Copyright Coalition and the Australian Copyright Council. Thanks so much for joining me today to find out more about copyright in the National Collection. The library's strongest purpose is to make sure that all Australians can access and use our material, and knowing how to navigate copyright is an important part of that. If you do have any questions or are just not quite sure about anything about copyright, please do get in touch with our Ask a Librarian service and we'll see what we can do to help you out.